Hey everyone! This is a quick reminder to subscribe and hit that like button. It lets me know that you are enjoying my content. Also, feel free to drop your suggestions for future stories in the comments below. Thank you for listening, and let's dive right in. I had worked as a train conductor for nearly 2 decades, long enough to think I had seen it all. Late-night drunks, fare evaders, lost tourists, and the occasional person who just wanted to talk. But when my manager, Greg, called me into his office that afternoon, I knew something was different. Greg was an older man with tired eyes, a permanent coffee stain on his shirt, and a habit of rubbing his temples when he was about to say something he didn't expect to go over well. He gestured for me to sit, his fingers tapping against the desk in an uneven rhythm. "There's a new route opening up," he started. "It's longer than what you're used to, more rural." I frowned. I liked my usual city circuits. Predictable, efficient, minimal nonsense. "And you want me to take it?" Greg exhaled, leaning forward slightly. "Lily, you're one of the best we've got. This route, it needs someone with experience." That choice of words made my stomach tighten. "Needs?" Greg hesitated. "The passengers are a little different." I raised an eyebrow. "Different how?" He rubbed his temples. "They're just strange. But you'll be fine. You follow protocol, you keep the schedule, and you'll be fine." Something about the way he said it sent a prickle down my spine, but I nodded anyway. A route's a route. Besides, if he was offering it to me, it meant more hours, which meant more pay. As I left the office, I nearly walked straight into someone. "Whoa there," a warm voice said. I looked up to see an older man smiling at me. His uniform was a little faded, his name tag read Henry, and he had a kind face, almost too kind. "You must be Lily," he said, adjusting his cap. "Greg told me you'd be taking over for me." I blinked. "You're the one retiring?" He nodded. "That's right, been on this route a long time, figured it was time to let someone else handle it." He paused, giving me an appraising look. "Would you like some company for your first shift? I can show you the ropes, introduce you to some of the regulars, make things easier." Something about the way he said that last part made my skin crawl. Make things easier. I wasn't sure why, but his kindness felt deliberate, almost practiced. Still, I shook the feeling off and forced a smile. "Sure, that'd be helpful." Henry beamed. "Great, I'll see you at the platform tomorrow." As he walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just agreed to something far bigger than a simple route change. Henry was already waiting by the train when I arrived for my shift. He was leaning against the side of the car, arms crossed, staring off toward the tracks like he had all the time in the world. As soon as he saw me, his face lit up with that same unsettling kindness. "Right on time," he said. I nodded, adjusting my conductor's hat. "Figured I'd get a feel for things before we start." Henry chuckled. "Good attitude. This job's all about routine." We boarded together, the train still empty before its first stop. I expected Henry to start explaining the route or maybe point out some quirks about the train itself. Instead, he reached into his pocket, pulled out a small, crumpled piece of paper and handed it to me. "Here," he said. "You're gonna need this." I unfolded the paper. The handwriting was uneven, written in dark ink that had smudged in places. As I read, my stomach twisted. 1. Never make small talk with the mustache man, just check his ticket and move on. 2. The old lady with the white dog will insist on getting off at the wrong station. Let her. 3. The teenage girl with red and blue hair will enter and exit multiple times. Never ask how she does this. 4. If the man with the duffel bag asks you to reach inside, do it. Take whatever is in there and ignore his reaction. 5. The office woman won't have a ticket. Give her one without question. I read it again, hoping I had misunderstood. Then I looked up at Henry. "Is this a joke?" His expression didn't change. "No?" I let out a short, nervous laugh. "Come on, Henry. This has to be some initiation thing, right? A way to mess with the new conductor?" He shook his head. "You'll see soon enough." Something about the way he said it made my throat go dry. I stared at the paper again, willing the words to mean something different, something normal. But they didn't. Henry clapped a hand on my shoulder. "Just follow the rules, Lily. It makes everything easier." The train let out a soft mechanical whine as it prepared for departure. I stuffed the paper into my pocket, my hands suddenly clammy. I didn't know what I had just gotten myself into. But something told me I'd find out soon enough. The train lurched forward. the rhythmic hum of the engine filling the cabin. I exhaled slowly, trying to shake the unease Henry's list had planted in my gut. Rules or not, this was still my job. I just had to focus. I adjusted my hat, straightened my uniform, and started my rounds. The first few passengers were normal enough. Tired workers, a couple of students, an older man reading a newspaper. I checked their tickets, exchanged the usual pleasantries, and moved on. For a brief moment, I felt ridiculous for letting Henry get into my head. Then I saw her. An elderly woman sat by the window, her wrinkled hands resting gently on a small white dog curled up in her lap. She had a warm, grandmotherly smile, the kind that made you feel instantly safe. "Good evening, ma'am," I said, offering my best professional tone. "May I see your ticket?" She nodded, fishing into her purse before handing me a slip of paper. I glanced at it. Destination: Stillbrook Station. That was 6 stops from now. She beamed at me. "Oh, what a lovely night for a train ride. Such fresh air outside. I'll be getting off at Fairpine." Fairpine was 3 stops away. I frowned, glancing at the ticket again. "Ma'am, your ticket says." Before I could finish, her expression changed. The light in her eyes flickered out like a candle in the wind. Her smile faded, her face slackening into something distant. Almost hollow. She turned her head toward the window and fell silent. A chill crept up my spine. I swallowed hard, Henry's words echoing in my mind. "Let her." Slowly I nodded, handed the ticket back, and stepped away. I tried to shake the feeling of unease, moving down the aisle to finish my rounds. When I circled back toward the front of the train, I glanced at the seat where Henry had been sitting. He was gone. I hadn't seen him leave, hadn't heard him move, but his seat was empty, as if he had never been there at all. Then I heard it. A soft, trembling sound. I turned my head slowly. The old woman was crying. She clutched her tissue with frail fingers, dabbing at her eyes. The little white dog sat stiffly in her lap, unmoving. The sight of her, so vulnerable, so wrong, made my stomach twist. And then, just as suddenly, "Did you tell her stop?" The voice was right next to me. I nearly jumped out of my skin. Henry was beside me, hands in his pockets, face calm. Too calm. He hadn't walked up to me. He hadn't been anywhere near me. I stared at him, heart hammering. "Where did you?" He ignored the question, nodding toward the old woman. "You need to help her off at Fairpine." I hesitated. "But her ticket." Henry gave me a small knowing smile. "Just follow the rules, Lily." I swallowed hard and nodded. When we reached Fairpine, I approached the woman cautiously. Her crying had stopped. She looked up at me, her lips curled into a serene smile. "May I help you get off, ma'am?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. She didn't speak, just gave a slow, deliberate nod. As we walked down the aisle, she looped her arm through mine, her grip cool and firm. The train slowed, then came to a stop with a low hiss. I led her onto the platform. She stepped onto the pavement, then turned back to face me. Her smile widened, too much for comfort, stretching almost unnaturally across her face. "I'm glad there are people who follow the rules," she whispered. Then, without another word, she turned and walked into the night. I stood frozen in the doorway until the train lurched forward again, leaving her behind. My pulse was still racing as I stepped back inside. The train rumbled forward, swallowing Fairpine Station into the darkness behind us. My pulse was still unsteady from the old woman's parting words, but there was no time to process it. Another stop was approaching. More passengers, more rules. I inhaled deeply, bracing myself as the train slowed. The doors hissed open. A few people trickled in. A couple of students, a man in a wrinkled suit, a tired mother with a sleeping child. And then, him. A tall, gaunt man stepped onto the train, cradling a large, battered duffel bag. His sunken eyes darted around the cabin before landing on me. My fingers curled into my palm. Henry's rule echoed in my mind. If the man with the duffel bag asks you to reach inside, do it. Ignore his reaction. The doors slid shut. I forced my feet forward. "Ticket, please," I said, keeping my voice steady. The man blinked, as if just noticing me. Then, without a word, he unzipped the duffel bag and held it out. The air felt heavier. The murmur of passengers dulled into a low hum. I hesitated. My instincts screamed at me to turn away. But I knew better now. I knew what happened when I didn't follow the rules. I reached in. The fabric was rough against my wrist, the inside far deeper than it should have been. My fingers brushed against something small, something soft. I pulled it out. A tiny stuffed monkey dangled from my grasp, its button eyes staring back at me. The man's entire body jerked. Then, laughter. A deep, frantic cackle spilled from his lips, raw and uncontrollable. Heads turned, passengers shifting uncomfortably at the sound. His laughter was too loud, too unhinged, echoing through the train like a broken record. I swallowed hard. "Thank you," I murmured, stepping away. The moment I turned my back, silence. The laughter stopped instantly like a switch had been flipped. I kept walking, my spine rigid. My breath felt too shallow, my heart beat too fast. "Then, you respected this one." Henry's voice was right beside me. I flinched, jerking my head toward him. He was just there, hands in his pockets, eyes unreadable. "It usually ends badly when you don't," he added, voice low. I wanted to ask what badly meant, but I didn't. I wasn't sure I wanted to know. Instead, I nodded and moved to the next passenger. And then I saw him, the mustache man. He sat near the window, dressed in a neatly pressed suit, his thick mustache curled at the ends. He was watching me, unblinking. The warning from the list flashed in my mind. Never make small talk with the mustache man, just check his ticket and move on. I swallowed my nerves and approached. "Ticket, please." The man's lips curled into a slow smile. "Ah, now, what's the rush?" His voice was smooth, velvety, wrong. "You have such a lovely presence. It's rare to see such." "Ticket," I repeated firmly. His smile twitched. His fingers drummed against the armrest. "Come now," he purred. "Surely a little conversation wouldn't hurt? Just a few kind words, a compliment, perhaps?" My jaw tightened. "Don't engage." I squared my shoulders. "Ticket, please." His eyes darkened. The smile vanished. For a long, terrible second, he simply stared at me. Then, without a word, he reached into his breast pocket and handed me the ticket. I checked it quickly, nodded, and walked away. I didn't look back, but I could feel his eyes on me the entire time. I kept moving. Anything to put distance between myself and the mustache man's lingering stare. The train hummed along the tracks, its steady rhythm almost soothing, almost. Then the next station arrived. The doors slid open, and among the handful of passengers stepping on, I noticed her immediately. A teenage girl with shoulder-length hair, half red, half blue. She wore a dark hoodie, her hands stuffed into her pockets, and she moved with the easy confidence of someone who had done this 100 times before. I glanced at my list. The teenage girl with red and blue hair will enter and exit multiple times. Never ask how she does this. She took a seat near the middle of the car. The doors shut. The train lurched forward. I watched from the corner of my eye as she gazed out the window, tapping her fingers against her knee. A normal passenger, by all appearances. But as soon as we reached the next station, she stood up and left. And just as the doors were closing, she stepped back on. I froze. I knew this was coming. I knew it. But watching it happen was something else entirely. Her seat was empty for mere seconds before she reclaimed it, her expression unchanged. She slumped into the same position, tapped her knee with the same rhythm, stared out the window with the same distant look. Like nothing had happened. The train pulled away. A chill ran down my spine. At the following stop, she did it again, and again, and again. Each time my stomach twisted tighter. The air felt heavier, pressing against my skin. On the fourth cycle, I forced myself to move, walking the length of the car, checking tickets, trying, desperately, to keep my mind from unraveling. But the déjà vu settled deep in my bones. I gritted my teeth. Follow the rules. Don't ask. Don't react. When she exited for the 5th time, I made the mistake of looking up, just as the doors started to close. She was staring directly at me. My breath caught. Then, in the blink of an eye, she stepped back inside, taking her usual seat, as if nothing had changed. I swallowed hard and turned away. "You did well." I nearly jumped at Henry's voice. I hadn't even noticed him appear beside me, but there he was, watching the girl with an expression I couldn't quite read. His approval should have made me feel better. It didn't. "Never speak to her about it," he murmured, his voice quieter than usual. "Never." I nodded stiffly. The night wore on. The passengers trickled away, station by station, until the train was nearly empty. The cabin felt eerily still, the hum of the train the only sound filling the space. I finally allowed myself to sit. The exhaustion hit all at once. My limbs felt heavier than they should, my mind thick with unanswered questions. I stared out the window, watching the trees blur past in the darkness. Then Henry spoke again. "I broke a rule once." I turned to look at him. He was seated across from me, his posture unusually rigid, his hands clasped together. His voice carried a weight I hadn't heard before. I hesitated. Which one? His jaw tightened. Doesn't matter. Silence settled between us, heavy and cold. I thought it would be fine, he finally continued. I thought maybe the rules didn't matter as much as they said. His fingers curled, knuckles whitening. I was wrong. A pause. Then he turned to me, and for the first time since I met him, I saw fear in his eyes. They don't forget, he whispered. They never forget. Henry's words hung in the air like a thick fog. They don't forget. I wanted to ask him what he meant. Wanted to press him for details, for some kind of explanation, but something about the way his hands clenched together, like he was holding himself together, kept me silent. Instead, I waited. Eventually, he spoke. When I first started, it wasn't like this, he said quietly. There were only 2 of them. I frowned. 2? The old lady with the white dog, he confirmed. And the duffel bag man. I thought back to the list, the bizarre rules, the way the old woman's face had changed when I tried to correct her, the duffel bag man's laughter. Henry exhaled slowly. They were manageable, strange but predictable. If you followed the rules, they never caused problems. He hesitated, then added, but then things started changing. A chill crept up my spine. More of them started appearing? He nodded. First, it was the mustache man, he murmured. Then the office woman, and after a while her. I didn't have to ask who her was. The girl with red and blue hair. The one who got on and off as if reality itself bent around her. Henry's gaze darkened. I knew better. I should have known better. But one night, I let my curiosity get the best of me. I swallowed. What did you do? His expression flickered with something raw. Regret, fear, shame. I asked. A lump formed in my throat. It was small, just an offhand comment, he whispered. I checked her ticket, she stood to leave, and I said something like, how do you keep doing that? The train rattled along the tracks, the air between us growing heavier. Henry took a shaky breath. She didn't react, didn't even look at me. She just stepped off the train like usual. His fingers curled tighter. But the moment the door started closing, I leaned out. The hair on my arm stood on end. I don't know why I did it, he said, his voice hoarse. I just had to know. I had to see what was happening. A pause. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she grabbed me. A shiver ran down my spine. I could almost picture it, the teenage girl's hand shooting out, fingers latching onto Henry's uniform, yanking him forward in one sudden, impossible motion. My stomach twisted. But, you're still here, I said slowly. You made it back. Henry didn't respond. Instead, his face drained of color. His gaze flickered toward the window beside us. Dread pooled in my chest. I turned my head. Outside, the dark countryside blurred past. The trees, the distant lights, the empty stretches of land. And then, my heart stopped. Lying on the tracks, half buried in the gravel, was a body. A man in a train conductor's uniform. Blood smeared across his face, limbs twisted at unnatural angles. My throat closed. I knew that face. I turned back to Henry, my pulse hammering against my ribs. He was staring at me, eyes hollow. I didn't, he murmured. My pulse thudded in my ears, louder than the rattle of the train as it sped through the night. My eyes were locked on Henry, but the realization was creeping up on me, slow and steady like a cold wind. The face I had seen lying on the tracks, it was his face. That twisted, mangled mess of a man in a conductor's uniform, with blood smeared across his face. But Henry was still sitting next to me, as real as anyone could be. His hands clenched tightly together, his gaze still hollow, as if trapped somewhere between 2 worlds. I opened my mouth to say something, but the words caught in my throat. My breath came in shallow, desperate gasps. That body, it was Henry's. But if it was Henry's, then... I glanced around at the other passengers. Their faces were blank, but there was something about their eyes, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I had thought they were just tired, distant, maybe lost in thought. But now it felt different. They weren't looking at me the way people look at strangers. They were looking at me with recognition. The chill crept up my spine again. They knew. They all knew. Henry didn't say anything at first. He just sat there, his gaze still fixed on me, his expression tight, as though he were holding something back. His fingers twitched, but he didn't move. It was then that I realized. It wasn't just his words that had been unsettling. Henry wasn't really there. I blinked, my throat closing in on me. My eyes burned with the sting of tears, but I couldn't let them fall, not yet. Not while everything was unraveling so fast. Henry, my voice cracked. You're not here, are you? He stared at me, his expression unreadable. But I could see it in his eyes. The sadness. The weight of it. He nodded slowly. She did this to me. My chest tightened, the truth settling in like a stone at the pit of my stomach. I felt dizzy, like I might fall into that abyss of confusion and despair if I didn't pull myself together. Who? What happened? Henry sighed, his shoulders slumping as though the weight of years was pressing down on him. It's complicated, but you're right. I'm not really here. Not anymore. His voice grew quieter, almost a whisper. I'm a ghost, Lily, trapped on this train. My job is to train my replacement. He looked at me, his eyes heavy with something I couldn't place. You. I froze, the blood draining from my face. The room around me seemed to shrink, the train rattling louder now, louder than it ever had before. What? No, I can't. He raised a hand to stop me, his eyes earnest, pleading. You're already here. You've seen things. You know what's coming. But it's not just about getting the rules right anymore. It's about survival. Survival? I whispered. The word felt wrong in my mouth. Henry's gaze turned distant for a moment, like he was looking past me, past everything, to some place far away. He seemed to gather himself before meeting my eyes again. New rules will appear over time. Things will change, and if you don't follow them, if you slip up, you'll end up like me, stuck here, forever. He stood then, his body unnaturally rigid as he shifted his weight. I think you're ready now. But before you go, there's one thing I need you to do. I watched him, my heart pounding, my hands trembling. What is it? He took a deep breath, his shoulders lifting as though he were preparing for something heavy. Just let someone know about my body, okay? The body you saw on the tracks. I don't care who, just make sure they find it. I felt like the world was slipping out from under me, and I didn't know how to stop it. The weight of what he was asking, the weight of everything, was more than I could bear. But I nodded. There wasn't really anything else I could do. Henry turned toward the window, and I could hear him exhale softly. For a moment, I almost thought he might disappear entirely, fading into the shadows of the train, like a memory fading in the dark, but he didn't. Instead, his gaze softened. I'm sorry, he said, his voice barely audible. I never wanted this for you. And just like that, he was gone. The air around me was thick with his absence. The train was quieter now, too quiet. It felt like something had shifted, like the very fabric of reality was bending in ways I couldn't understand. I blinked once, twice. My hands were still shaking. But Henry wasn't there anymore. He had disappeared completely, leaving nothing behind but the echoes of his words and the heavy silence of the train. And now I was alone. But the rules hadn't changed. The train kept moving, and I knew, with the cold certainty of someone who had just learned a terrible truth, that there would be no turning back. I sat in silence, the weight of everything pressing down on me. The train rattled on, but I barely heard it anymore. My mind was a blur of images, fragmented moments that I couldn't piece together. Henry's words echoed in my head, his hollow eyes still burned into my memory. The body on the tracks, the rules, my replacement. I wasn't sure how much of what I'd just experienced was real, but the feeling of his absence, of him not being there, was the most real thing I'd ever felt. He was gone. And yet, I was still here. The train was quieter now, almost peaceful, if it weren't for the oppressive weight hanging in the air. The other passengers sat around me, their eyes distant, unfocused, like they hadn't noticed the tension that had been building for what felt like hours. Maybe they didn't notice because they couldn't. Or maybe they had already accepted it, whatever it was. I wiped away the tears that I hadn't even realized had started to fall. My cheeks felt cold, wet against my skin. I wasn't sure why I was crying. Was it for Henry? For myself? Or for the realization that my world had been irrevocably twisted, that nothing would ever make sense again? I looked to the empty seat beside me, imagining Henry still there, his quiet presence a comfort even though I knew it was gone. I had so many questions, so many things I still didn't understand, but there was one thing I could say for sure. He had saved me. Thank you. I whispered into the empty air. For saving me. A small smile tugged at the corner of my lips, even as my heart ached. He was gone, but at least I hadn't followed him into the darkness. At least I still had time. For a moment, I thought I saw a shadow shift in the corner of my vision, and I held my breath. But when I looked, nothing was there. The train slowed, the distant hum of the tracks beginning to change as the final station approached. My chest tightened. This was it, the end of the line. But even knowing that, I couldn't shake the fear that something else was waiting for me. I stood up, my legs unsteady, my hands still trembling. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. There was no turning back. I had to face whatever came next. Whatever rules there were, I had no choice but to follow them. The train pulled into the station, the doors sliding open with a quiet hiss. The platform was empty. No one in sight. I glanced around, expecting some strange new figure to step into view. But there was only silence. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw her. The girl with the red and blue hair. She stepped off the train like she always did, the weight of her presence making the air feel heavier. She glanced over at me as she passed, a smirk playing at the corners of her lips, as though she knew something I didn't. Something I couldn't understand. I watched her go, heart pounding in my chest. I wasn't sure if I was more terrified of her or the realization that there was still more to this. More to what Henry had tried to warn me about. More rules, more people, more of whatever this was. I swallowed, forcing myself to breathe, to focus. The station was empty now. The last passenger had disembarked and the quietness felt too loud. Taking another deep breath, I straightened my uniform, the fabric stiff against my skin. I had to hold it together. I had to keep going. There was no other choice. I looked toward the front of the train, the door that would take me back to the control booth, to my shift, to the place I wasn't sure I even belonged anymore. I didn't know who would be next, or what would happen when the next set of rules arrived. But I knew one thing for sure. I was still here. And for now, that was enough. The next shift would begin soon. And I would be ready. With a final glance at the empty platform, I stepped off the train, my heart still pounding, but my resolve firm. The unknown awaited. And I had no choice but to face it.